So around this time last year, I showed you lot this monoblock steel cassette that I picked up on AliExpress. For the price, just 66 quid, delivered to my house. Yeah, I thought this was pretty incredible, to be honest with you. It's always shifted really, really nicely, and at just 200 grams, it weighs pretty much the same as the equivalent Shimano Dura Ace cassette as well. But the durability, well, yeah, let's get into it. My name, as always, is Luke, and welcome back to Trace Velo. Right, so I was out riding yesterday on this bike behind me, actually, using this cassette here, and I noticed that when I got out of the saddle to sprint, the chain started to skip slightly. Now, I initially thought that maybe what was happening is the chain was catching on the next kind of sprocket next to it, trying to downshift, as it were, but no, turned out to be a pretty classic case of worn out cassette teeth. Now, I did actually replace the chain on this bike about a week before, but I made sure that old chain never exceeded 0.5% wear, which is kind of recommended for 11-speed drivetrain. So I was quite hot on chain replacement, actually. But regardless, the 8th gear on this cassette, it's now completely shot, which is a bit of a shame because all the other gears are absolutely fine. But considering this is, well, it's a monoblock design for the cassette, it means I can't swap out that individual sprocket like I could do on a more traditional cassette. So yeah, this whole thing is now trash. So the big question, how many miles did it actually end up doing? Well, yeah, no, not that many really. I calculated it just over 2,500 miles. So what's that? About 4,000 kilometers there or thereabouts? Yeah, not incredibly impressive, it has to be said. Like I said, I was pretty quick about swapping out the chain when it got worn out. Not so much about kind of keeping the chain really, really clean. I know there are some of you out there that are super fastidious with that kind of stuff, and I'm pretty good, but I did let the chain get black and dirty a couple of times riding over the winter, which yeah, probably didn't help, to be honest with you. Now, waxing chains, I've never been bothered with. I actually use this green Finish Line oil. I know I'm gonna get roasted in the comments for using it because I know it's not the best stuff, but I think it's probably quite representative of what a lot of you out there will be using as well. But I mean, regardless, even under ideal conditions, I think I would have struggled to get another 500 miles out of this cassette. So how does that compare to a legitimate Shimano cassette? A bit like this one. Well, using exactly the same chain lube, because that's the stuff I've always used, actually, and riding under pretty much exactly the same conditions, I would normally expect to get at least 4,500 miles, if not 5.5, out of a cassette like this. Now, there are undoubtedly people out there that claim to get 10,000 miles plus out of their cassettes using a proprietary blend of paraffin wax, tungsten disulfide, and the excretions of a GCN presenter for chain lube. But yeah, not this guy. I mean, I do use an ultrasonic cleaner, but with a cheap chain lube and a kind of semi-regular cleaning schedule, yeah, 5,000 miles was typical for me out of a Shimano cassette, maybe 6 at a push. So half the mileage out of this cassette, and that honestly did surprise me. Like, all the teeth are steel, it seems really well made. I just expected more out of this thing. So why is that? Why did this thing wear out so quick? Well, firstly, though difficult to definitively say, I suspect the steel used on this cassette is of a slightly lower grade. I know Shimano use decent chromoly steel alloys for their cassettes, and they also incorporate a heat treatment as well to increase hardness. I wasn't able to find any information on the alloy used for this cassette, which leads me to believe it's probably of a kind of cheaper variety, but let's do a quick test. Okay, right, a quick and dirty hardness test on the steel for these cassettes, and it can be done with just a file. So this is just a needle file here. So first let me show you what a really hard steel sounds like. So this is a headset bearing, and the outer race here is a very hard steel. It's been case hardened. And hopefully you can hear the file kind of struggles to bite into the steel. It basically skates over the top. That tells me it's a very hard steel. A very soft steel would be, yeah, this cheap claw hammer. This shaft here is made of steel, not hardened at all. And hopefully you can hear, yeah, the file just bites right into the steel there. It's very, very soft. So those are the two extremes. Okay, let's kick it off with this really cheap cassette that I got from a brand called Sunshine on AliExpress. And I've put fine, basically brand new, because I only use this for a few hundred miles. And I noticed the hardening of this steel wasn't particularly uniform. So right here, yeah, hopefully you can hear the file. You can really feel it dig into the steel. it doesn't skate over the top like it did on that headset bearing, whereas on other bits, it kind of does. So on the edges of the teeth, has a tendency to skate over the top. So yeah, overall, the hardening of this cassette, it's not very uniform, not very good. Right, next up, this legitimate Shimano 12-speed 105 cassette here, and hopefully you'll be able to hear. Yeah, the file, it bites in ever so slightly, but yeah, skates pretty nicely over the top of yeah, all these teeth. And I've tested it on loads of these teeth, and the hardening is much more uniform than that Sunshine cassette. So yeah, while it's not quite as hard as that headset bearing here, because you don't really want that, you do want a little bit of give in the teeth, so they're not too brittle. But either way, this is a good example kind of how it should be done. And finally, this monoblock Ztto cassette that we've been chatting about, and I've been testing it. It's pretty hard, actually. Pretty much as good as the Shimano one down here. It's not quite up to the same standard because there are a few softer teeth. Whereas on the Shimano one, basically all the teeth seem to be just as hard as all the other ones. Whereas there are patches on this cassette where I can feel it bite in a little bit more than other areas. But overall, I'm still pretty impressed, actually. It's a lot harder than I initially thought it would be. So still pretty impressive. In fact, I've just been testing that kind of 8th gear that failed on me. And yeah, there are certain areas around there where it's not quite as hard. You can hear that bites in slightly there, whereas on other teeth, skates a bit more nicely over the top. So yeah, the case hardening, not quite as uniform on this Ztto cassette, at least from what I can tell. Right then, mainly because I got this really cool footage while I was lucky enough to be out skiing, well, snowboarding in Bulgaria last week, Siroko. So I wear their cycle kit on every ride that I do, but they also do some wicked looking ski gear. I know the extreme levels of pink aren't necessarily for everyone, but yeah, just ever so quickly, it'd be great if you could check them out. They're such a great sponsor, and if you use my link below, you can get 10% off anything they do: cycle kit, workout gear, ski gear, and even golf stuff now, actually. Yeah, all sorts. So check them out, and thank you very much. So the actual steel alloy that both these cassettes are made out of might differ, but the hardness was relatively similar between the two, even if it was slightly less consistent on this black one here. But still, from what I can tell, durability has a lot to do with the coatings applied to the cassette too. This cheaper Ztto monoblock cassette appears to have a very basic black oxide coating on it. So this is done by dipping the raw steel cassette into an alkaline bath, and the coating it produces is incredibly thin. I think it's like half a micron thick, something like that, and it wears off very easily as well. But it's a cheap and relatively quick process that does add some decent corrosion resistance over a raw steel finish. Shimano, on all but their really low budget stuff like this 8-speed road cassette here, which also appears to have a black oxide finish, tend to use an electroplated nickel coating. You can see that on this 12-speed 105 cassette that I've been showing you. Now, there are a couple of dull patches on there that indicate a little bit of chain wear, but overall it has a nice shiny nickel plating. But interestingly, that nickel is technically softer than the base steel underneath. So why does that increase durability? Well, from what I can tell, there are two main reasons for this. Number one, compared to steel, nickel plating is highly resistant to rust and oxidation. And number two, it creates a nice smooth surface on top of the steel. So this smooth uniform surface greatly reduces friction, and from what I've read, it also resists micro pitting much better than the raw steel, so just increases the overall lifespan of the cassette. So why do you rarely see it on cheaper cassettes? Well, it should be obvious, it's cost, right? You can slap on a black oxide coating for a couple of pennies, whereas an electroplated nickel coating is a multi-step process, and nickel itself is quite expensive compared to steel, actually, so it can easily add a couple of dollars per unit. When you're competing pretty much solely on cost, it does make sense to cut it out, right? Now, you can find some cheaper nickel-plated cassettes on AliExpress, but they're few and far between, and 95% of the time, the cassettes either have a black oxide coating or a zinc plating, which I think this one here does. Again, zinc adds some decent corrosion resistance, but it's much less durable than nickel plating, and zinc itself is a much cheaper material as well, hence its use on these cheaper cassettes. So no, these cheaper cassettes generally won't last as long as their Shimano counterparts, but if you shop around, they can offer some really good shifting performance, and for the price, you get get some really lightweight cassettes as well. As I mentioned in a previous video, this cassette is just 200 grams for 66 quid. For an equivalent cassette from Shimano, you're looking at their Dura-Ace CSR 9100, which is at least 3 times the cost, if not a bit more actually, in places. So even with the lower durability on this thing, the trade-off is still worth it, in my opinion. But do let me know what you reckon. Now, to replace this worn out cassette, I put it on the bike already actually, it's this one. It's the latest generation of cassettes from Ztto. I think they're calling it their SLR Gen 3. It's incredibly lightweight at just 122 grams. However, I suspect the overall durability of this thing is gonna be worse than this black cassette. Even though the surface finish looks different, I reckon that silver color on there is some form of zinc plating. I reckon the underlying steel alloy is gonna be exactly the same, but to save as much weight as possible, those first 3 sets of teeth are all milled out of aluminium. These teeth, in my experience, wear out incredibly fast actually. Even if you try your best to stay out of those climbing gears wherever possible, it's always the aluminium teeth that wear out kind of first on the cassette. So I reckon I'm gonna get a lot less miles out of this thing. Actually, I think I'll be lucky to get 2,000, but I'm gonna keep it on the bike and I'll yeah, keep you posted. So subscribe if you like this kind of thing, hit the like button, and that'll do. So yeah, see you next time. Ciao.
It's the bonus clip time.
Okay, quick bit at the end here, kind of like an RFQ in a way, I suppose. Basically, I'm looking to bring on board a video editor, actually. Ideally someone that knows about bikes, that would be amazing, and someone based in the UK as well would be good, although that's not a deal breaker. If you're based elsewhere, that should be fine. And it's a paid position. I'm not expecting people to work for free or anything like that. And yeah, kind of bring you on board as a freelancer under like a kind of a contractor role. But then if it all goes really well, you could become like a permanent member of staff, which would be amazing. I'd love to start building a kind of legitimate team around this whole thing. So output wise, I'm aiming at the moment for a video a week, normally between 15 minutes and half an hour. I'm really struggling to hit that at the moment. So to have some help with the edit would be fantastic. So I do everything on Adobe, so that's a bit of a requirement. Premiere Pro for 95% of stuff. I don't think my edits are very complicated. I've got a few effects that I throw on the timeline, like warp stabilizer, but mostly it's audio leveling, color grading, and just kind of cut away to B-roll, really. Although if you can bring some animation chops to the table, like you know After Effects really well, that'd be amazing. I'd love to put some infographics onto certain episodes, but I just don't have time to teach myself After Effects along with everything else. So if that sounds like you or someone you know as well, then my email's at the bottom of the description. I would love to hear from you. So send me your kind of hourly or daily rate and then a bit of an example of what you do. And yeah, kind of we'll have a chat. Like, yeah, I'd love to just have someone else to work with, not just as an editor, but also to bounce ideas off of as well. Just to, yeah, like I said, start building a team around this whole thing would be wicked. So yeah, look forward to chatting with some of you, and yeah, see you next time. Ciao.